The morning sun rose slow over the rolling fields, gilding the dew that clung to the blades of grass. Samuel Carter stood at the edge of his land, hands on his hips, staring at the horizon that had shaped him since childhood. This farm wasn't just soil and fence lines, it was history, sweat, and legacy. It had been in his family for 3 generations, built from the ground up through hard work and determination in the face of relentless discrimination. Samuel often said, "This land remembers us, even when the world doesn't want to." But that morning, something was different. His gravel driveway, the one path that connected him to the road, was blocked, completely sealed off by 3 massive bulldozers. Engines cold but parked with precision, like sentinels daring him to challenge their authority. On the side of each machine was a fresh decal, property of Oak Ridge HOA. Samuel clenched his jaw. The Homeowners Association had been trying for months to intimidate him, throwing violation notices on his porch, calling his farm an eyesore in the middle of their polished suburbia. But this was a direct act of war. Neighbors began to gather at the edges of their manicured lawns, some whispering, others smirking. They had underestimated him, thought he was just one man tending an old farm in a county that had moved on. What they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was the truth Samuel had carried quietly for years. The paperwork sat in a locked chest inside his house, deeds that stretched across acres and boundaries. He didn't just own the farm. He owned the land beneath their homes, their parks, and yes, even the street they walked on. The bulldozers stood tall, but Samuel smiled faintly. They had no idea whose ground they were standing on. The day stretched heavy with silence. Samuel walked slowly toward the bulldozers, his boots crunching on gravel, every step echoing louder than the last. He reached out, running his hand across the cold steel, and thought of his grandfather. It was his grandfather who had worked 2 jobs to buy the first 100 acres during an era when black families were denied loans, when banks closed their doors at the sight of brown skin. Yet somehow, he persisted. Through patience and grit, acre by acre, parcel by parcel, he built an inheritance not in gold but in land, a kingdom of soil. The HOA president, Richard Halstead, arrived in a spotless white truck. He stepped out in khakis and polished shoes, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone who believed power came with signatures on neighborhood bylaws. "Mr. Carter," he called out, his voice laced with condescension. "You've ignored our notices long enough. This property isn't fit for the standards of Oak Ridge. We're taking action until you comply." Samuel said nothing at first, only studying him with calm eyes. Richard mistook the silence for submission and smiled thinly. "This land may have been here before our community, but times change. We have rules now." Samuel finally spoke, his voice deep, steady, and unshaken. "Rules written for whose comfort? Whose image? You think 3 machines can erase 3 generations?" His words rolled out like thunder, and for the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising into the air. They expected anger, maybe even desperation, but what they saw instead was dignity, dignity that came from knowledge, from the kind of power no bulldozer could flatten. Samuel turned back toward his house, a slow smile forming. The chest inside, the one with deeds and documents, would soon speak louder than Richard's smug authority. The HOA thought they had cornered him. But they had just walked into a trap built long before they even arrived. That night, Samuel sat at his old oak table, the chest open before him. He unfolded each deed carefully, the paper yellowed with age, ink faded but still proud. His grandfather's name, his father's name, and now his own, all bound together by signatures that had endured through eras of oppression. Each document was a testament that his family had not only survived history but had claimed their rightful stake in it. He traced the maps with his finger, seeing the boundaries spread wider than most would believe possible. Oak Ridge was not built around his farm. Oak Ridge was built upon it. Memories flooded back, stories his father told of neighbors who spat at him for daring to own land, officials who tried to swindle them with low offers, and townsfolk who mocked the idea of black ownership as temporary, as fragile. Yet his family never sold, never surrendered. They endured droughts, economic downturns, and even threats. The land was not just a possession, it was defiance carved into soil. The following morning, Samuel carried the stack of papers into town. At the courthouse, he requested certified copies. The clerk, a young man who recognized the Carter name, raised his eyebrows in quiet respect as he stamped the seals. News traveled fast in small towns, and by the time Samuel returned, whispers had grown louder. People began to realize that the old farmer might not just be another resident fighting a losing battle against the HOA. That afternoon, he pinned one deed to the gate at the end of his driveway. The neighbors gathered again, reading the boundaries written in bold ink. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lines on the map crossed into their subdivisions, their cul-de-sacs, even the HOA's pristine community center. Suddenly, the bulldozers looked less like weapons and more like trespass. Samuel leaned against the fence, watching their faces twist between disbelief and fear. Richard returned in a fury, clutching a binder of bylaws. "This doesn't change anything," he barked. "You're still subject to the rules of this community." His words, sharp and frantic, revealed cracks in his authority. Samuel didn't raise his voice, but his calm carried more weight than Richard's bluster. "I don't answer to your rules," he said evenly. "This county answers to mine." The silence that followed was heavy, like a storm about to break. One of the neighbors, a woman who had lived in Oak Ridge for years, finally spoke up. "Wait, does this mean we've been living on his land all along?" Her voice trembled, and the question spread like wildfire. Murmurs erupted. Some were defensive, others fearful, but all shared the same realization: the balance of power had shifted. The bulldozers, once symbols of control, now looked absurdly out of place, parked on land they had no right to touch. Samuel walked over, climbing onto one of the machines. From that vantage point, he addressed the crowd. "For years, you've tried to push me out, to make me feel small on the land my family bled for. But here's the truth: you're standing on ground that carries my family's name. You can cover it with asphalt, you can plant your gardens, but the soil remembers." Richard's face reddened, but he could see the tide turning. The HOA's grip was slipping. Neighbors avoided his gaze, ashamed of their part in the harassment. For Samuel, it wasn't about revenge. It was about respect, dignity restored in front of those who had tried to strip it away. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the bulldozers, Samuel knew the fight wasn't just about property lines. It was about history standing tall against erasure. Days later, the bulldozers were gone. Quietly towed away in the night, as if erasing evidence of a miscalculation too great to admit. Richard and the HOA board retreated into silence, their threats now hollow, their meetings suddenly absent of Samuel's name. The community had been forced to confront the truth, not only of the land but of the man who stood guard over it. Samuel continued his routines, tending crops, mending fences, living as he always had. But the air around him had changed. Where once there was hostility, now there was an uneasy respect. Some neighbors approached with apologies, others with offers of friendship. Samuel accepted none with haste. Trust was not built in days, and scars did not heal with words alone. But the dignity that had been tested had also been reaffirmed. One evening, standing on his porch, Samuel looked out across the fields. He thought of his grandfather, of nights when men rode up with torches, of days when the bank tried to squeeze them out. They had endured because they had believed in something greater than fear. Land was not simply wealth, it was identity, memory, survival. And now, it was proof that his family's legacy was larger than any rulebook a neighborhood could conjure. To the world outside, it may have been a story of a farmer against an HOA. But to Samuel, it was a chapter in a much longer narrative, the story of black resilience, of history carried forward despite attempts to bury it. The bulldozers had tried to block his driveway, but in doing so, they had uncovered a truth too powerful to silence: Samuel Carter did not just belong to the land. The land belonged to him, and through him, to every ancestor who refused to bow.